Thaddeus Brennick came to Thornhill Crossing the way ghosts come to old houses, quietly, without permission, already inside before anyone realized the door had been left open. His truck was a 1998 Ford F-150, the color of rust and regret. It rattled down Highway 89 like a man clearing his throat before confessing something he'd rather keep buried. The Montana sky stretched above him, pale and indifferent, the kind of December sky that made noon look like late afternoon. Thad's hands stayed steady on the wheel. Large hands, calloused, built for work that didn't photograph well. He was 43 years old, though the lines around his eyes suggested a man who'd lived several extra years inside his own head. 6'1", he leaned the way a knife is lean, the way something becomes when everything unnecessary has been scraped away. His face was clean-shaven, the skin tight over a square jaw and high cheekbones weathered by wind and sun, and things that don't heal just because you stop looking at them. His hair was dark brown, clipped military short on the sides, left slightly longer on top. Just long enough to admit he'd stepped out of uniform. Not long enough to prove he belonged anywhere else. Gray threaded through the hair at his temples like early frost on dark soil. His eyes were the most noticeable thing about him. Gray-blue, the color of winter sky right before snow falls. They didn't linger on things. They measured, scanned, dismissed. Not out of arrogance, out of habit. Years of learning that danger doesn't announce itself with a handshake. He wore an olive field jacket, the elbows worn smooth and thin from years of leaning against things that didn't give. Beneath it, a burgundy flannel shirt, the kind that smelled like wood smoke, even when it was clean. Moss green cargo pants, pockets deep and practical. Cognac brown leather boots scuffed at the toes, laced tight. On his left wrist, a military-issue watch with a scratched face and a second hand that kept ticking like it had never heard the word discharge. Behind him, sitting upright in the back seat, was the only creature in the world Thad trusted without conditions. Ranger, a German shepherd, 7 years old, black and tan with a deep sable shadow along his back that made him look like he'd been dipped in darkness and pulled out just in time. His chest and legs were warm gold, the color of late autumn, refusing to surrender to winter. He wasn't bulky, he was athletic, all working muscle and quiet readiness. His ears stayed up even when he rested, pivoting at the smallest sound like radar dishes scanning for signals no one else could hear. His amber brown eyes watched the world with the calm intensity of a sentinel who did not need applause to stay vigilant. Around his chest, a tactical harness, black nylon with reinforced stitching, a handle at the top positioned perfectly for extraction or guidance. The kind of gear that said this dog wasn't a pet. This dog was a professional, sewn onto the harness in faded yellow thread, K9 Unit 447. Ranger's expression was not cute, it was intelligent, thoughtful. Sometimes when the wind hit a certain way, or Thad did something particularly questionable, almost offended, as if the universe had failed to file the proper paperwork before misbehaving. He lifted his head now, watching through the window as the first buildings of Thornhill Crossing slid into view. The town looked like a postcard someone had left out in the rain. Buildings that had once been proud now sagged, slightly, roofs heavy with snow, windows dark. A neon sign over the only bar flickered weakly, its glow half-hearted, as if it didn't want to admit it was still alive. Snow covered everything in a clean blanket, a liar's blanket, hiding cracks and rotting wood the way polite conversation hides grief. Thad slowed the truck as he entered Main Street. For a moment, some irrational part of him, still young enough to believe in welcome, expected something. A face he might recognize, a neighbor waving, a sense of arrival. But the sidewalks were empty. The town stared back without blinking. Ranger's body shifted. He sat up straighter. A low sound formed in his throat. Not a bark, not a growl meant to scare. A warning note, soft and controlled, a sound that said, "Something is wrong here. Something is watching." Thad glanced in the rearview mirror. "What is it, buddy?" Ranger's gaze didn't move. His ears stayed forward, locked onto something Thad couldn't see. Thad felt the old familiar tightening in his ribs, the sensation of a world holding its breath. He hated it. He'd come here to stop living that way. He'd come here to be ordinary. He'd been out of the Navy only 6 months, but his body still moved like it was answering orders. Shoulders squared, always alert, always ready, even in a town that looked like it had forgotten how to fight. Thad told himself Ranger was just adjusting. Dogs remembered too. They carried war differently. No speeches, no medals, no explanations, just instincts that never fully switched off. Ranger had served. Ranger had sniffed out dangers men couldn't see. Ranger had learned that silence could hide teeth. And now Ranger was telling him Thornhill Crossing had teeth. Thad drove past the bar, past the boarded-up hardware store, past the post office where the flag hung stiff in the wind, as if even patriotism had frozen. He turned onto a narrower road, following directions scribbled on a piece of paper tucked into his sun visor. The trees thickened quickly. Pines stood in tall ranks heavy with snow. Their branches bent under the weight, creating arched tunnels that made the road feel like a passage into something ancient. The sky grew lower, pale, the kind of winter sky that made you forget what warmth felt like. 40 acres. That's what he'd bought. Sight unseen. $11,800. Every dollar he had left after discharge, after selling the truck he didn't need, after paying off debts to people he'd rather forget. 40 acres of Montana forest. Far enough from everything to disappear. Close enough to a town to buy groceries without becoming a hermit. Or so he told himself. The land appeared suddenly through the trees, a clearing roughly circular, ringed by pines. Snow drifted across the open space in smooth, unbroken waves. No cabin, no structure, just land. Raw, empty, waiting. Thad killed the engine. Silence poured in, not peaceful silence, the kind of silence that felt like an unanswered question. He opened the driver's door and stepped out, boots sinking into snow. The air slapped him immediately, sharp, clean, merciless. He breathed it in anyway, as if cold could scrape his lungs clean. Ranger jumped down from the truck with a soft thud, landing steady, head up. He moved in a slow circle around Thad, checking the perimeter, nose close to the ground. His tail was low but not tucked. Alert, not afraid. Thad watched him and felt something in his chest loosen just slightly. Ranger had that effect. He unloaded his gear from the truck bed, a duffel bag worn green canvas, a Coleman tent older than most marriages, a folding camp stove, a cooler with 3 days' worth of food, a toolbox, a case of bottled water, a military surplus sleeping bag that had seen better decades. His life simplified by loss. Thad set up the tent in the center of the clearing, or tried to. The ground was harder than he'd expected, frozen beneath the snow. The tent pegs refused to sink. The poles fought him. The fabric sagged on one side like a drunk leaning against a lamppost. When he finally stepped back, the tent looked less like shelter and more like a mistake someone had made and then abandoned out of embarrassment. Ranger sat 10 feet away watching, his head tilted, slowly, precisely, 45 degrees to the left. His eyes remained locked on the tent, unblinking, judgmental. Thad wiped snow from his gloves. "Yeah, I see it," he muttered. Ranger blinked, once, slowly, the kind of blink that said, "I'm not angry, just disappointed." Thad barked out a short laugh, humorless, the kind of laugh that exists purely to keep a man from shouting. "Well," he said, voice low, "it'll hold." Ranger's expression suggested otherwise. By the time dusk arrived, Thad had managed to start a small fire in a ring of stones he'd cleared from the snow. The flames threw warm light against the trees, making the clearing feel less abandoned and more alive. Not much, but enough. He ate a cold sandwich, drank water from a bottle that tasted faintly of plastic. Ranger got kibble mixed with a little canned chicken Thad had brought specifically for him. Ranger accepted it with dignified reluctance, the way a soldier accepts a promotion he didn't ask for. Thad sat on a log near the fire hands wrapped around a tin cup of instant coffee. He stared into the flames and tried not to think about the things that always surfaced when the world went quiet. Afghanistan, 2019. July heat that felt like punishment. Sand in his teeth. The radio crackling with static and panic. His voice, steady, giving the order. Corporal Vance, 23 years old. Following that order, the explosion. Not loud in memory, just final. Thad closed his eyes and forced the images back down. He'd learned the trick. You didn't fight the memories, you just acknowledged them and let them pass like storm clouds. Eventually they moved on, usually. Ranger, who had been lying near the fire, suddenly lifted his head. His ears snapped forward. His body went rigid. Thad's muscles tensed before his thoughts caught up. "What?" Ranger stood, silent as smoke. He walked to the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees. He didn't bark. He didn't scratch. He simply stared. Body angled forward, tail low, eyes locked on something Thad couldn't see. Thad rose slowly and moved beside him. He followed Ranger's line of sight. Nothing, just trees, just snow, just the fading light turning everything gray. But Ranger's gaze never wavered. Thad felt the hair on his arms rise. There was no reason someone should be out here. Not tonight, not in this cold. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. hadn't spoken to a soul, and yet Ranger's instincts didn't lie. For one irrational moment, Thad thought of old stories, tales his grandmother used to tell, of forests that tested strangers, of unseen judges who watched from the woods to see what kind of man had arrived. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in patterns, and he believed in Ranger. Thad rested his hand on Ranger's neck. Warm fur, solid muscle, real. Easy, he murmured. Not because Ranger was panicking, because Thad needed the reminder himself. Ranger let out that low, controlled sound again, a warning that vibrated in his chest. Then he turned and walked back to the fire. Slowly, as if whatever he'd seen had been noted and filed away for later consideration. Thad stayed at the edge of the clearing a moment longer, listening, watching. Nothing moved, but the feeling remained, an unseen pressure in the air. A shift in the world that couldn't be explained by wind or cold or imagination. Thad exhaled slowly, breath fogging in the freezing air. He walked back to the fire and added another log. Sparks spiraled upward into the darkening sky. He sat down and pulled the sleeping bag around his shoulders. Ranger lay beside him close enough that Thad could feel the rise and fall of his breathing. Outside the circle of firelight, the forest waited, patient, silent, knowing something Thad didn't. Morning and Thornhill Crossing arrived like a polite stranger, quiet, pale, unwilling to make promises. Thad woke before the sun fully lifted its head above the pines. The tent was cold enough to make his breath visible. The kind of cold that didn't shock you so much as remind you gently and repeatedly that comfort was a luxury. He dressed quickly, same clothes, same boots, same watch ticking faithfully on his wrist. Ranger rose the moment Thad shifted. The German shepherd stretched long and controlled, then stood with that familiar readiness. Ears up, eyes steady, body angled as if the world might need negotiating at any second. Thad stepped outside. The forest greeted him with snow and silence. Sunlight filtered through pine branches, turning falling flakes into drifting sparks. The air smelled clean, sharp resin, cold earth, the faint metallic taste of winter. For a moment, Thad stood still, letting the cold bite into his cheeks. He told himself this was why he'd come back. Not for company, not for closure. For this. Space. Quiet. A world that didn't ask him to perform. Ranger sniffed the edge of the clearing, then moved toward the tree line, nose low. His tail remained level and calm. Not wagging, not stiff. He was working. Reading the ground the way Thad used to read doorways. Thad watched him and made a decision. All right, he said. Let's see what we bought. He pulled a folded surveyor's map from his jacket pocket. The property boundaries were marked in red ink, showing 40 acres in an irregular shape that followed the natural contours of the land. He wanted to walk the perimeter, get a sense of what was his, plan where to build. Thad started toward the eastern edge, boots crunching through snow. Ranger didn't follow. Thad stopped, turned. Ranger sat in the center of the clearing, 10 feet from the tent, completely still, watching Thad with an expression that bordered on defiant. Come on, Thad said. Ranger didn't move. Thad frowned. Ranger, heel. Nothing. The dog sat like a statue, ears forward, eyes locked on Thad, not challenging, just refusing. Thad felt a flicker of frustration. Ranger never disobeyed. Not like this. Not without reason. He walked back toward the dog. What's wrong? Ranger stood, slowly, then turned and walked toward the western edge of the clearing. Not the direction Thad had planned, the opposite direction. He stopped after 20 feet and looked back, waiting. Thad's jaw tightened. KI 9 Unit 447, heel. It was the voice he'd used in the field, command voice, the voice that left no room for negotiation. Ranger sat down where he was, staring into the trees to the west. Then he looked back at Thad, amber eyes steady, patient, insistent. Thad exhaled through his nose, a long, slow breath that fogged in the cold air. He'd learned over 7 years that Ranger didn't do this without cause. If the dog refused an order, it meant the order was wrong. It meant there was something Thad couldn't see, and ignoring that had gotten people killed. All right, Thad said quietly. Show me. Ranger stood immediately and walked into the trees, purposeful, deliberate, not running, not hesitating, moving like he knew exactly where he was going. Thad followed. They walked for nearly 20 minutes, through pine forest thick enough that the sky disappeared, over fallen logs crusted with ice, through drifts that rose to Thad's knees. The forest was silent except for the crunch of their boots and paws, the occasional crack of a branch under snow. Ranger didn't look back. He moved with the certainty of a dog following a scent, but his nose wasn't to the ground. His head was up, as if he was navigating by memory, or instinct, or something else Thad didn't understand. The trees began to thin. The ground sloped downward slightly, and then Ranger stopped. Thad came up beside him and froze. There, half buried in the snow and earth, overtaken by years of moss and creeping vines, was a rail car. Not a building, not a shed, a train car, diesel locomotive model C N2847, old, rusted, the kind that hadn't been in service since the late 80s. It sat at a slight angle as if it had been driven here and then abandoned when the ground gave way beneath it. Snow piled against one side. Pine saplings grew through gaps in the metal paneling. The wheels were half sunk into frozen earth covered in rust and rot. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving only patches of faded red and gray beneath layers of grime. It should not have been here. Thad's eyes scanned the surrounding area. No tracks, no obvious road. But then he saw them. Faint depressions in the earth. Parallel lines barely visible beneath decades of accumulated forest debris. An old logging road. The kind they'd used in the 80s before environmental regulations shut them down. Someone had driven this rail car in, back when the road was still passable, back when you could move heavy equipment through these mountains without anyone asking questions. And then they'd let the forest reclaim the evidence. Thad's pulse quickened. Not from fear, from recognition. The same recognition he'd felt in the field when something didn't fit the pattern. When the world presented a piece that didn't belong. Ranger walked forward slowly, nose twitching, body tense but controlled. He circled the rail car once, then sat down in front of a side door that hung slightly ajar. He looked at Thad. Thad approached carefully. His boots crunched through ice-crusted snow. He stopped at the door and peered through the gap. Darkness, stale air, the faint smell of rust and old paper. He pulled a small flashlight from his jacket pocket. Military issue. Still worked. He clicked it on and shone the beam inside. The interior of the railcar had been converted into something else, not cargo space, a workspace. Makeshift shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of years. Papers scattered across a metal table. A folding chair tipped on its side. Filing cabinets with drawers half open as if someone had left in a hurry. Thad pulled the door wider. It groaned on rusted hinges. He stepped inside. The air was colder here, stiller, like the railcar had been holding its breath for decades. On the table, documents. Yellowed. Brittle. Thad leaned closer, shining the flashlight across faded typewritten text. Environmental Impact Report. Grimwood Extraction, Inc. 1988 to 1989. His eyes scanned the pages. Soil samples, water quality tests, mercury concentration levels. But something was wrong. Numbers had been crossed out, rewritten in pen, entire sections blacked out with thick marker. Thad picked up another sheet, a map, hand-drawn, showing the area around Thornhill Crossing. 7 locations marked with red X's, each one labeled Restricted Zone. One of the X's sat directly over the land Thad had just purchased. He felt his stomach tighten. On the wall, pinned crookedly, was a Polaroid photograph. Faded. The colors bled into each other. 3 men standing in front of this very railcar. Younger. Smiling in that forced way people smile when they're not actually happy. Thad held the flashlight closer. One of the men had a thick mustache. Broad shoulders. Familiar. It looked like Sheriff Dalton Merrick. 35 years younger. But the same eyes. Thad lowered the flashlight and kept searching. In the corner on the floor, partially buried under loose papers, was a Timex wristwatch. The leather band cracked and stiff. The face scratched. The second hand frozen at 3:11. Engraved on the back in small, careful letters, St. Veritas Liberabit Latin. Thad knew enough to translate. Truth will set you free. And beneath the watch, a letter, handwritten. The ink faded but still legible. The handwriting shaky as if written in haste or fear. Thad unfolded it carefully. The paper cracked at the creases. He read, "If anyone finds this, I am already dead. My name is Silas Thornwell. I worked as an environmental consultant for Grimwood Extraction from 1986 to 1989. What I discovered will destroy this town if it comes to light. But the truth is worse than silence. Grimwood buried 40 barrels of mercury sulfide in 7 locations across this valley. The soil reports were altered. The water tests were falsified. I have the proof. I brought it here because I knew they were coming for me. If you are reading this, trust the dog. Dogs can smell what we cannot. They know the poison is still here. Do not let them bury this again. Silas Thornwell, November 1989. Thad's hands tightened on the letter. His breath came slow and controlled, but his heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at Ranger, who sat in the doorway, silhouette framed by pale morning light. The dog stared back, calm, patient, as if he'd known all along what they would find. Thad folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He took the watch, the photograph, the map. Then he stepped outside and closed the railcar door behind him. The forest was silent. Snow continued to fall in soft, deliberate flakes. Thad knelt beside Ranger and rested his hand on the dog's neck. "You knew," he whispered. Ranger's tail thumped once against the snow. Slow, deliberate, like a gavel coming down. Thad stood. He looked back at the railcar one more time. A ghost, a grave, a warning left by a dead man. He'd come to Thornhill Crossing to disappear. But the dead don't let you disappear. Not when they've been waiting 35 years to be heard. Thad turned and started walking back toward the clearing. Ranger followed close at his side. Behind them, the railcar sat in silence, waiting, patient, knowing that some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the hole. Thad didn't go back to the tent. He drove straight into Thornhill, crossing, the letter from Silas Thornwell folded in his jacket pocket like a lit match he couldn't put out. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, this time alert, and still watching the road with the focus of a soldier returning to a place he'd already mapped. The town looked different in full daylight. Not better, just more honest about its decay. Storefronts with peeling paint, sidewalks cracked and patched too many times. A few pickup trucks parked at angles that suggested their owners had stopped caring about lines. Thad pulled up in front of a building that announced itself with a hand-painted sign, Thornhill Historical Society and Public Library. The paint was faded. The building itself was brick old enough to have seen the town's better days and kept quiet about them. He killed the engine and looked at Ranger. "You coming?" Ranger's ears flicked forward. He stood shook once and waited for Thad to open the door. Inside, the library smelled like old paper and heating oil. Rows of metal shelves lined the walls, stuffed with books that looked like they hadn't been opened since before the internet made research easy. A few tables sat empty near the windows. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a pale institutional glow. Behind the circulation desk sat a woman Thad hadn't met yet. She was maybe 39, 40 at most, thin in a way that suggested she forgot to eat when she was working. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a practical bun, a few strands escaping to frame a pale face dusted with faint freckles across the bridge of her nose. Her eyes were brown, deep, the kind of eyes that had spent too much time looking at things most people preferred to ignore. She wore a gray wool sweater with ink stains on the cuffs. Her hands, when she reached for a book, moved with quick, nervous energy. The hands of someone who worked too much and slept too little. A faint scar ran along one knuckle. Healed. Old, but noticeable. She looked up when Thad entered. Her gaze moved from him to Ranger, then back. She didn't smile, but her expression softened slightly. Recognition, maybe. Or just the instinct of someone who understood that a man with a dog like that wasn't here for the bestseller shelf. "Help you?" she asked. Her voice was low, even, the voice of someone who'd learned not to waste words. Thad approached the desk. "I'm looking for information on Grimwood extraction, 1985 to 1990. The woman's hands stilled, just for a second. Then she nodded. "Mining records are in the back, historical documents section." She paused. "You new here?" "Bought land," Thad said. "Just outside town." Her eyes sharpened. "Which parcel?" Thad pulled out the surveyor's map and unfolded it on the desk. She leaned forward, studying the boundaries. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture tightened. "That's old Grimwood territory," she said quietly. "So I've heard." She looked at him for a long moment, measuring, deciding something. "I'm Dr. Iris Calloway," she said finally. "I used to work for Grimwood Development, geologist, until 8 months ago." Thad waited. Iris glanced toward the empty library, then lowered her voice. "You find something out there?" Thad didn't answer directly. "You got fired for a reason." Her jaw tightened. "I found mercury concentrations 52 times the EPA limit in groundwater samples. I filed a report. 2 weeks later, the report disappeared. So did my job. NDA violation, they said." She reached under the desk and pulled out a worn accordion folder. She set it down between them. "This is everything I kept. Soil samples, water tests, maps showing contamination spread, all dated 2024. Thad opened the folder. Inside were lab reports, charts, handwritten notes, and tight, meticulous script. Locations circled in red. numbers that climbed far beyond any safe threshold. "Why are you still here?" Thad asked. "Because leaving means they win." Iris's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "And because someone needs to remember what they buried." Thad pulled the letter from his pocket and laid it on the desk. "Silas Thornwell, you know the name?" Iris's eyes widened. She picked up the letter carefully as if it might disintegrate. She read it twice. Her hands trembled slightly when she set it down. "He disappeared in 1989, she whispered. "Hiking accident, they said. No body ever found." She looked up at Thad. "Where did you get this?" "Rail car, half a mile into the forest on my land." Iris stood abruptly. "Show me everything." They spread the documents across one of the library tables. The map Thad had found, the photograph, Iris's contamination reports. The letter. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged. 7 locations marked on Silas Thornwell's 1989 map. 7 locations that matched elevated mercury readings in Iris's 2024 tests, 35 years apart. Same poison, same cover-up. Grimwood extraction shut down in 1990, Iris said, tracing the map with one finger. Officially, they exhausted the mineral deposits, but Silas's letter says they were burying waste. Mercury sulfide, 40 barrels. 40 barrels don't just disappear, Thad said. No, they get buried, deep. In places no one would think to look. Iris tapped the map. Your land is one of them. Thad felt the weight of it settle in his chest. He'd spent $11,800 on poison ground. If this gets out, Iris continued, her voice tight, Grimwood development goes bankrupt. EPA cleanup could cost $50 million or more. And this town, she gestured toward the window toward the empty streets beyond. Grimwood employs 180 people. Without them, Thornhill Crossing dies. So people stay quiet. People survive. Iris's eyes met his, until someone doesn't let them. The library door opened. A man stepped inside. 52, maybe 53. Tall, trim. The kind of physical fitness that came from money and personal trainers, not labor. His hair was silver gray, combed back from a high forehead. His face was angular, handsome in a way that suggested good genetics and expensive skincare. He wore a charcoal suit. Tailored. No tie, but the top button of his white shirt was fastened with a small silver pin. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine despite the snow outside. He smiled, the kind of smile that existed only from the lips outward. "Dr. Calloway," he said. His voice was deep, warm, the kind of voice that made you want to trust it even when you knew better. "I didn't expect to see you here." Iris's posture went rigid. "Mr. Grimwood," Sterling Grimwood. Thad recognized the name from the documents. Son of the original owner, current CEO of Grimwood Development. Sterling's gaze moved to Thad. The smile stayed in place, but his eyes sharpened. "And you must be our newest landowner. Thaddeus Brennick, correct?" Thad didn't ask how he knew. Small towns had ways. "Mr. Grimwood," Thad said evenly. Sterling approached the table, hands in his pockets. Casual, unthreatening. He glanced at the documents spread across the surface. His expression didn't change, but Thad saw the flicker. Recognition. Calculation. "I heard you bought the old Thornwell parcel," Sterling said. "Beautiful land, remote, perfect for someone looking for privacy." "That was the idea. I also heard you might be looking to develop it, build a cabin perhaps." Sterling pulled a business card from his jacket and set it on the table. "I'd like to make you an offer. $25,000, cash, more than double what you paid." Thad looked at the card, Grimwood Development, Sterling's name embossed in gold. "Not interested," Thad said. Sterling's smile tightened just slightly. "I understand the impulse to hold on to land, but that parcel has complications, zoning issues, soil instability. You'd be doing yourself a favor." "I'll manage." "Mr. Brennick." Sterling's voice dropped lower, quieter, the warmth gone. "Thornhill Crossing is a small town. It survives because people understand how things work. My company employs most of the families here. We provide stability, security. Sometimes that means making difficult choices about what information serves the greater good." Thad met his gaze, gray-blue eyes steady, unflinching. "You're asking me to pretend I didn't find something. I'm asking you not to destroy a town over a 35-year-old mistake." Sterling straightened. "My father made errors in judgment. I've spent 2 decades trying to keep this community alive despite them. If you expose what's buried out there, the EPA will declare it a Superfund site. Grimwood will collapse. 180 people will lose their jobs. their homes, their future. He picked up his business card and held it out. Think about what kind of man you want to be, the one who saves a town or the one who buries it. Sterling set the card down again. Then he turned and walked out of the library, his footsteps echoing on the tile floor. The door closed behind him. Iris exhaled slowly. That's how he operates. Reasonable, calm, makes you feel like you're the villain if you don't agree. Thad stared at the business card. He's scared. He should be. Iris gathered the documents and slid them back into her folder. If you're serious about this, I can help. I know where to send soil samples. I know which federal agencies to contact. But you need to understand what you're walking into. Thad looked at Ranger, who sat near the table watching both of them with calm, amber eyes. I didn't come here for this, Thad said quietly. No one ever does. Iris's voice softened. But you found it anyway. Question is, what are you going to do now? Thad didn't answer because he didn't know yet, but Ranger's gaze stayed steady, patient, as if the dog already understood what Thad was still trying to decide. The diner sat at the edge of Main Street, a squat building with faded yellow siding and a red neon sign that blinked the words Kemp's in erratic rhythm. Thad pulled the truck into the gravel lot and killed the engine. He hadn't eaten since yesterday, and he needed time to think. Inside, the diner smelled like grease and coffee and the ghost of 1,000 breakfasts. Red vinyl booths lined the windows. A long counter ran along one side, stools bolted to the floor. The walls were covered in old photographs. Thornhill Crossing in its glory days. Loggers, miners, people who'd believed the work would last forever. A woman stood behind the counter wiping down the surface with a damp rag. She was 54, maybe 55. Short, solid. Her blonde hair had faded to the color of old wheat pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her face was lined, but her eyes were sharp. The kind of woman who'd raised kids and run a business and didn't have patience for nonsense. She looked up when Thad entered. Her gaze moved to Ranger, then back. He trained, she asked. Yes, ma'am. Then he's welcome. She gestured toward a booth near the back. Sit anywhere. Thad slid into the booth. Ranger lay down beside it, head up, eyes scanning the room. The woman brought over a laminated menu and a cup of coffee without asking. Martha Kemp, she said. I own the place. Thad Brennick. I know. Word travels. She pulled a pen from behind her ear. What'll it be? Eggs, toast, whatever you've got. Martha nodded and walked back toward the kitchen. Thad sipped the coffee. It was strong, bitter, the kind of coffee that didn't apologize for what it was. He glanced at Ranger. The dog's ears were relaxed, but his eyes tracked every person who walked past the window outside. Martha returned with a plate, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, a side of bacon. She set it down, then paused. That's your dog or a working dog? Both. She studied Ranger for a moment. My son's 11. Loves dogs. He'd probably try to pet that one if I let him. Thad looked up. Where is he now? School gets out at 3. Martha's expression softened slightly. You got kids? No. She nodded, didn't push, just refilled his coffee and walked away. Thad ate slowly. The food was simple, honest. It tasted like something made by someone who understood that feeding people mattered. He was halfway through when Martha brought over a basket. She set it on the table without a word. Inside were 2 house-made sausages still steaming. Ranger's nose twitched. His eyes tracked the basket, but he didn't move, didn't beg, just watched with polite interest. Martha pulled one sausage out with a napkin and held it toward Ranger. For the professional. Ranger leaned forward, sniffed carefully. His nostrils flared. He processed the scent for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned his head away, deliberately, as if the sausage had personally offended him. Martha blinked. He doesn't want it. Thad suppressed a smile. He's got standards. Ranger looked at Thad, then at Martha, then back at the sausage. His expression was clear. I appreciate the gesture, but this does not meet quality specifications. Martha laughed. Actually laughed. Well, can't say I've been rejected by a dog before. She took the basket back to the kitchen, still chuckling. Thad looked at Ranger. You just insulted her cooking. Ranger's tail thumped once, unapologetic. Thad shook his head and returned to his eggs. A few minutes later, the door opened again. A man stepped inside. Not Sterling Grimwood this time. Someone else. Younger, maybe mid-30s, broad-shouldered, wearing a canvas jacket and work boots caked with mud. His face was weathered, the kind of weathering that came from outdoor labor, not age. He saw Thad and walked over. No hesitation, no introduction. You're the guy who bought the Thornwell land, he said. Thad set down his fork. That's right. You planning to stay? Haven't decided. The man leaned against the booth. Grimwood offered you money yet? Thad didn't answer. The man smiled. Not friendly. Knowing. Yeah, he does that. Offers you just enough to make leaving easy. And if you don't leave, he shrugged, things get complicated. Who are you, Darna? Nobody. Just a guy who used to work for Grimwood Extraction, back when they were still digging. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and set it on the table. You want to know what they buried out there? Start with the hospital records. 1990 to 1995. Cancer rates, miscarriages, kids born with defects. Thad picked up the paper. It was a list. Names, dates, causes of death. Why are you giving me this? Thad asked. The man straightened. Because somebody should know. And because you look like the kind of guy who doesn't run when things get hard. He turned and walked out before Thad could respond. Martha appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the paper on the table, then at Thad. He's right, she said quietly. My sister died in 1993. Ovarian cancer, 32 years old. They said it was genetic. But 6 other women on our street died the same way within 3 years. Thad's chest tightened. People here know, Martha continued. We just don't talk about it, because talking means losing what little we have left. She walked away, leaving Thad alone with the list and the weight of other people's grief. Ranger shifted slightly, resting his chin on Thad's boot. Thad reached down and rested his hand on the dog's head. Outside, snow began to fall again. Soft, quiet, erasing everything. The radio crackled to life while Thad was driving back to the clearing. He'd tuned it to the local station mostly for weather updates, but the voice that came through wasn't talking about snow. Repeat 11-year-old Owen Kemp and 9-year-old Cody Harlan missing near Old Mine Trail. Last seen approximately 2:15 p.m. today. Search and rescue en route. If anyone in the area has information, please contact Thornhill County Sheriff's Department immediately. Thad's hands tightened on the wheel. Old Mine Trail. He knew where that was. He'd passed it on the way to his land, less than 2 miles from the clearing. Owen Kemp, Martha's son. He glanced at Ranger. The dog was already standing in the passenger seat, ears forward, body tense, alert in a way Thad hadn't seen since they'd left active duty. Thad told himself it wasn't his problem. He wasn't part of this town, wasn't responsible for someone else's kid. But Ranger barked, sharp, loud, 3 times in rapid succession. Thad had never heard him do that, not once in 7 years. Ranger didn't bark. He communicated through posture, through stillness, through the controlled use of his body. But now he barked, urgent, insistent, demanding. All right, Thad said quietly. All right. He turned the truck around and headed toward Old Mine Trail. The trail was barely a road, more like 2 ruts carved into frozen mud winding through dense pine forest. Thad drove as far as the F-150 could manage, then parked and got out. Ranger jumped down and immediately started moving. Not running, working, nose low, head sweeping side to side. Tracking. Thad followed. They moved through the forest for nearly 30 minutes. Ranger set the pace. Steady, deliberate, pausing occasionally to recalibrate, then continuing with renewed focus. The snow was deeper here. Untouched. No footprints, no sign of search and rescue yet. Then Ranger stopped. He stood at the edge of a depression in the ground. Not a natural valley, something else. The snow had settled unevenly, revealing a circular dip maybe 15 feet across. Ranger's body went rigid. He stared at the center of the depression. Thad approached carefully. The ground felt wrong beneath his boots, soft, unstable. And then he heard it, a voice, small, weak, coming from below. Help! Thad dropped to his knees. Hey, can you hear me? I'm stuck. The ground, it broke. A second voice, even younger. My leg hurts. 2 boys, Owen and Cody. Thad brushed snow away from the edge of the depression. Beneath it, the earth had collapsed inward, creating a sinkhole about 4 feet deep. At the bottom, barely visible in the failing light, were 2 boys huddled together. Owen Kemp, 11 years old. Dark hair, face streaked with dirt and tears. Beside him, Cody Harlan, 9, smaller. His left leg was pinned beneath a section of collapsed soil. I'm coming down, Thad said. Don't move. He lowered himself carefully into the sinkhole. The walls were unstable, crumbling at the slightest pressure. The smell hit him immediately. Sulfur, rotten eggs, the unmistakable stench of hydrogen sulfide. Mercury contamination. The soil was breaking down from the inside. Thad reached the boys and knelt beside them. You hurt anywhere else? Owen shook his head. Cody whimpered. My leg, I can't. I can't feel it. Thad examined the trapped leg. The soil had shifted, pinning it against a rock. But the leg itself didn't look broken, just compressed, losing circulation. All right, I'm going to move the dirt. When I do, you both pull free. Understand? Both boys nodded, tears streaming down their faces. Thad braced himself and began scooping soil away with his bare hands. The ground was cold, damp. It smelled like poison. Behind him, Ranger barked once, a warning. Thad glanced up just as the far wall of the sinkhole began to collapse. Now, Thad shouted. He grabbed both boys and pulled. Owen's leg came free easily. Cody screamed as his leg released, but Thad didn't stop. He lifted both boys and threw them toward the edge of the sinkhole just as the ground beneath his feet gave way. He dropped another 2 feet, landing hard on his knees. Pain shot up his legs. The sinkhole was deepening, unstable, ready to swallow him completely. Ranger's head appeared at the edge. The dog barked again. Then he turned and ran. Thad's heart sank. For a moment, he thought the dog had abandoned him. But 30 seconds later, Ranger returned, dragging a fallen branch in his jaws. 10 feet long, thick enough to hold weight. The dog dropped one end over the edge of the sinkhole. Thad grabbed it, tested it, solid. He pulled himself up, hand over hand, boots scrambling for purchase on the crumbling walls. His shoulders burned. His hands were numb, but he didn't stop. He hauled himself over the edge and collapsed onto solid ground, gasping. Owen and Cody sat a few feet away, shivering but alive. Ranger stood between them, tail low, eyes scanning the forest, still working. Thad forced himself to his feet. He picked up both boys and started walking back toward the truck. Ranger led the way, choosing the path, stopping when the ground felt wrong, guiding them through the forest like a soldier leading a patrol through hostile territory. By the time they reached the truck, Thad's arms were shaking. He set the boys in the back seat and wrapped them in blankets he kept behind the driver's seat. You're okay, Thad said. You're safe. Owen's teeth chattered. The ground, it smelled bad. Then it just broke. Cody nodded, too terrified to speak. I know. Thad's voice was quiet, steady. I know. He drove straight to the sheriff's department. Martha Kemp was already there, pacing outside, her face pale with fear. When she saw the boys, she ran to the truck and pulled Owen into her arms, sobbing. Another woman appeared, younger, late 30s. She grabbed Cody and held him tight, tears streaming down her face. Sheriff Dalton Merrick stepped out of the building, 68 years old, broad-shouldered but stooped slightly, as if the weight of the badge had finally started to bend him. His mustache was gray-brown, neatly trimmed. His eyes were tired, the kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep. He looked at Thad, then at Ranger, then at the sinkhole, dirt still caked on Thad's boots. You found them, Merrick said. Dog found them. Merrick studied Ranger for a long moment. That's a good doing. Ranger's ears flicked. He turned his head slightly. The slow blink of a professional being told something he already knew. Martha looked up from Owen, her face streaked with tears. Thank you, God, thank you. Thad nodded once. He didn't know what to say, didn't trust himself to speak. He climbed back into the truck. Ranger jumped in beside him. As Thad pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Merrick was still watching, his expression unreadable. Back at the clearing, Thad sat in the truck for a long time without moving. His hands still trembled, not from cold, from something else. The echo of adrenaline, the memory of walls collapsing, the smell of sulfur that still clung to his clothes. Ranger rested his head on Thad's lap. Thad looked down at him. You saved them. You know that. Ranger's tail thumped once against the seat. Slow, deliberate. Thad exhaled. He thought about the sinkhole, the poisoned ground. The boys who'd almost died because someone had buried 40 barrels of mercury 35 years ago and pretended it didn't matter. He thought about Sterling Grimwood's offer, $25,000. Enough to leave, enough to disappear. He thought about Martha Kemp's sister, the list of names, the people who'd died quietly while the town stayed silent. And he thought about the letter in his jacket pocket. Silas Thornwell's last words. Trust the dog. Thad reached for his duffel bag in the back seat. He unzipped it and started packing. Clothes, gear, everything he'd need. Ranger watched him, ears forward, body tense. Thad zipped the bag closed. He opened the driver's door and stepped out. Ranger jumped down after him. Thad walked toward the tent, toward the truck bed, preparing to load everything up, preparing to leave. He reached for the tent pole. Ranger moved, not fast, not aggressive, just positioned himself directly between Thad and the truck, and sat down. Thad stopped. Move, Ranger. The dog didn't move. K9 Unit 447, load up. Ranger turned his head, looking not at Thad, but toward the forest. toward the place where the railcar sat buried, toward the 7 red X's on Silas Thornwell's map. Then he looked back at Thad, amber eyes steady, patient, unyielding. Thad felt something crack inside his chest. Not break, just shift, like ice giving way to spring. He knelt down in the snow, eye level with the dog. "You're not letting me leave, are you?" Ranger didn't blink. Thad rested his forehead against Ranger's, felt the warm fur, the solid presence, the quiet certainty of a creature who had never once lied to him. "All right," Thad whispered. "All right, old friend. We stay." Ranger's tail wagged. Once, twice. Then he stood and walked back toward the tent. Thad remained kneeling in the snow for a long moment. He'd come to Thornhill Crossing to disappear, to escape the weight of decisions made in deserts half a world away, to stop being the man who gave orders that got people killed. But Ranger had other plans. And maybe Thad thought that was the point. Maybe courage wasn't about running toward danger or away from it. Maybe it was about staying. Even when leaving was easier. Even when the ground beneath you was poisoned and the truth would cost more than you wanted to pay. Thad stood. He left the duffel bag where it was, unpacked the tent, rebuilt the fire, and as the flames grew casting light against the darkening trees, he made a decision. He wasn't running anymore. Not from ghosts. Not from guilt. Not from the quiet insistence of a dog who refused to let the truth stay buried. Somewhere in the forest the railcar waited, and somewhere beneath the snow 40 barrels of poison leaked into the earth. But Thad Brennick, 43 years old, gray-blue eyes, and a past he couldn't outrun, was done pretending he didn't see it. He was staying. And tomorrow he would decide what that meant. The fire came 3 days later. Not from lightning, not from accident. From the kind of inevitability that builds when you ignore a problem long enough that nature decides to solve it for you. Thad woke to the smell of smoke at 4:47 in the morning. He knew the time because his military watch glowed faintly in the darkness of the tent, and he'd learned years ago to note details before his brain fully processed what they meant. Ranger was already standing, body rigid, nose pointed toward the tent flap. A low rumble vibrated in his chest. Not a warning for Thad, a warning about the world outside. Thad pulled on his boots and stepped into the December cold. The sky to the west glowed orange, not sunrise, fire. The kind of glow that meant something big was burning and didn't plan to stop. He grabbed the radio from the truck and turned it to the emergency frequency. Static crackled, then a voice broke through. All units, all units. Wildfire reported in Sector 7 Old Mine Trail vicinity, wind gusts 40 miles per hour. Fire spreading east toward residential areas. Evacuation orders in effect for the signal cut out, smoke interference, thick enough to choke radio waves. Thad adjusted the dial, but the static only grew worse. He clicked it off and shoved it in his jacket pocket. Ranger barked, once. Sharp. The sound cut through the morning like a gunshot. Thad looked at him. The dog was staring toward the road that led back to town. His ears were forward, his tail low and still. The posture of a dog who had made a decision and was waiting for his human to catch up. "What is it?" Ranger barked again. Then he started walking. Not toward the fire, toward town. Thad's instincts screamed at him to load the truck and drive the opposite direction. Fire and dry Montana forest wind of 40 miles per hour evacuation orders. Every tactical bone in his body said, "Get out now." But Ranger kept walking. And Thad, against every survival instinct he'd honed over 2 decades, followed. He drove the F-150 back toward Thornhill Crossing with Ranger sitting upright in the passenger seat, nose pressed to the cracked window. The smoke thickened as they got closer. Gray-black columns rising into the pale pre-dawn sky. The smell of burning pines so strong Thad could taste it. The town was chaos. People loading cars, kids crying, sirens wailing from the volunteer fire station. Sheriff Merrick stood in the middle of Main Street, directing traffic with the exhausted authority of a man who'd stopped believing words mattered, but kept saying them anyway. Thad pulled up beside him. Merrick turned, his face streaked with ash. "Brennick, you need to evacuate. Fire's jumping containment lines." "Where's it headed?" "East, toward the residential zone." Merrick's jaw tightened. "We've got crews trying to cut a fire break, but the wind's too strong. If it reaches the housing development..." A woman ran up to them, Martha Kemp. Her face was pale, eyes wild with panic. "Sheriff Owen's missing." Merrick's expression went flat. "What?" "He went camping last night with Cody near Thornwell Creek." Martha's voice broke. "That's in Sector 7, right where the fire..." She couldn't finish. She didn't need to. Merrick reached for his radio. All units, we have 2 minors unaccounted for in the fire zone. 11-year-old Owen Kemp and 9-year-old Cody Harlan, last known location, Thornwell Creek campsite. The radio crackled back. Sheriff, fire crews are pulling out. It's not safe. We can't. I'm not asking for fire crews. Merrick looked at Thad. His eyes were hollow, defeated. I'm asking for a miracle. Thad should have said no, should have driven away, should have let the professionals handle it. But Ranger was already out of the truck, standing at the edge of Main Street, staring toward the smoke. Thad looked at Martha, at the raw terror in her face, at the way her hands shook as she clutched her phone like it might ring with good news. He thought about Corporal Vance, 23 years old, following Thad's orders into a building that collapsed 30 seconds later. He thought about all the decisions he'd made that couldn't be unmade, all the voices that still woke him at 3 in the morning asking why. And he thought about a Pai who refused to let him run. Where exactly? Thad asked. Martha pulled up a map on her phone with trembling fingers. Here, Thornwell Creek. There's a campsite marker. Owen texted me at 8 last night, said they were setting up tents. Thad memorized the location. Stay here. If I find them, I'll bring them back. You can't go in there alone. But Thad was already moving. Ranger fell into step beside him. Perfect heel position. The way they'd moved through Kandahar, Mosul, a dozen other places where the air tasted like smoke, and the only person you could trust was the one walking beside you. The road to Sector 7 was blocked by fire crews. Thad took a logging trail instead, the F-150 bouncing over ruts and fallen branches. Smoke poured through the vents even with the windows closed. Ranger's nose twitched constantly, processing information Thad couldn't access. Half a mile from Thornwell Creek, the road ended. Burned through, trees on both sides engulfed in flames that climbed 200 feet into the air. Heat radiated through the windshield. The temperature inside the truck climbed to 80-90, pushing toward unbearable. Thad killed the engine, looked at Ranger. Last chance to stay here. Ranger jumped out before Thad finished the sentence. They moved on foot. Thad had a wet bandana tied around his nose and mouth. Ranger's breathing was controlled, shallow, conserving oxygen. The dog led. Thad followed, staying low, moving through patches of unburned ground, avoiding the worst of the smoke. The forest was a nightmare. Flames on 3 sides, ash falling like snow, the roar of fire so loud Thad couldn't hear his own breathing. Heat pressed against him like a physical force trying to push him back, trying to make him turn around. Ranger stopped, his ears swiveled, locked onto something ahead. He started moving again, faster now, purpose in every step. They found the campsite at 6:23 in the morning. 2 tents, both still standing but surrounded by fire closing in from the west. A creek ran along the eastern edge, the water low and sluggish, barely 3 feet across. Ranger barked, 3 times, loud, commanding. A tent flap opened. A boy stumbled out. 11 years old, an ash-streaked face, coughing. Owen Kemp. Behind him, another boy emerged. Younger, 9, Cody Harlan. The friend Owen had been camping with. Thad ran to them. You hurt. Both boys shook their heads, too terrified to speak. Creek, now, get in the water. The boys didn't argue. They scrambled to the creek and dropped into the shallow water. Thad followed, pulling them close to the bank, where the overhang provided some protection from radiant heat. Ranger stood at the edge, scanning the fire, looking for a way out. There wasn't one. The flames had closed the gap they'd used to enter. Fire on 3 sides now. The creek ran east, but 100 yards downstream, a massive pine had fallen across the water, fully engulfed. They were boxed in. Thad's mind raced. No radio signal, no backup, no air support. Just him, 2 kids, and a dog in a kill zone that was shrinking by the second. Ranger barked, sharp, insistent. Thad looked. The dog was staring at a rock formation on the northern edge of the campsite, a gap between 2 boulders, maybe 4 feet wide, leading into darkness. A cave, or a crevice. Something. Move! Thad grabbed Owen and Cody and pushed them toward the rocks. Go follow the dog. Ranger disappeared into the gap. The boys followed, crawling on hands and knees. Thad came to the last, feeling the heat sear his back as he squeezed through. Inside, the air was cooler, not fresh, but breathable. The space was narrow, maybe 15 feet deep. The rock walls radiated cold, a pocket of stone that fire couldn't touch. Thad pulled the boys to the back of the crevice. They huddled together, shaking, crying, alive. Ranger lay across the entrance, blocking it with his body, nose pointed out, watching, guarding. Outside, the fire raged. Trees exploded, the sound like artillery. The light beyond the gap turned from orange to white to something beyond color. Minutes passed, or hours. Time stopped meaning anything in the dark. And then the sound changed. The roar faded. The light dimmed. The heat began to retreat. Thad waited another 10 minutes. Then he crawled forward. Ranger moved aside to let him pass. Thad peered out. The world was black, charred, every tree within 100 yards reduced to smoking skeletons. The ground was covered in ash so thick it looked like snow. But the fire had passed, moved on, chasing the wind toward whatever was left to burn. "It's over," Thad said quietly. "We can go." They emerged from the crevice into a landscape that looked like the end of the world. The boys clung to each other. Owen was crying. Not from fear anymore, from relief so overwhelming it had no other outlet. Ranger led them out, picking a path through the ash, avoiding hot spots where embers still glowed. The smoke was thinner now, breathable. The sky overhead was pale gray, the sun trying to break through. They reached the truck at 7:41. But something was wrong. The F-150 sat at an angle. The front tires melted. The paint blistered. The windshield cracked from heat stress. It wasn't going anywhere. Thad loaded the boys into what was left of the back seat anyway, using blankets to protect them from the hot metal. Then he started walking, Ranger beside him. Halfway back to town, a tree fell. Not burning, just dead, weakened by fire. It came down across the road directly in front of them. Thad stopped, assessed. The tree was massive, 60 feet long, 2 feet in diameter, branches tangled across the entire width of the road. He turned to look for another route. Behind them, a second tree fell. This one was still burning. It crashed down across the road, blocking the way they'd come. Flames licked up from the trunk, the heat immediate and intense. They were trapped between two trees on a road barely wide enough for a vehicle. Thad's chest tightened. He looked at the tree ahead, unburned, but impossible to climb over with two exhausted kids. Ranger stared at the fallen tree. His body was tense, calculating. Then Ranger ran forward. "Ranger, no!" The dog didn't stop. He reached the fallen tree and squeezed underneath, disappearing into the tangle of branches. Thad's heart stopped. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then Ranger emerged on the other side. He barked once, turned, ran back under the tree toward Thad. He grabbed Thad's pant leg with his teeth and pulled. Thad understood. "Boys, follow me, stay low." He dropped to his stomach and crawled under the tree. Owen went next, then Cody. The space was tight. Branches scraped their backs. Ash filled their mouths. But they made it through. Thad pulled both boys to their feet on the other side. Behind them, the burning tree was spreading, flames reaching toward where they'd been standing seconds ago. They ran, Ranger led, setting the pace, pausing only to make sure Thad and the boys kept up. At 9:17 in the morning, Sheriff Merrick's cruiser appeared through the smoke. He slammed the brakes and jumped out. Martha Kemp was in the passenger seat. She ran to Owen and collapsed to her knees, pulling him into her arms, sobbing, shaking, whispering, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," like a prayer. Cody's mother appeared from another vehicle behind Merrick's. She grabbed her son and held him like she'd never let go. Merrick walked up to Thad. The old sheriff looked at him, then at Ranger, then at the two boys covered in ash but breathing. Merrick's voice was hoarse. Thad didn't answer. He knelt beside Ranger. The dog was limping, his right hind leg barely touching the ground. Blood seeped through the singed fur where something had cut him. A branch, a rock, fire. "Hold still," Thad whispered. He examined the leg carefully, a deep gash along the muscle. Not broken, but bad. Ranger's eyes met his, amber, calm, as if pain was irrelevant when the job was done. Thad's vision blurred. He pressed his forehead to Ranger's. "I'm not losing you," he whispered. "Not again. Not ever." Ranger's tail thumped once against the ash-covered ground. Slow, deliberate, forgiving. Merrick helped Thad lift Ranger into the cruiser. Martha took Owen and Cody in another vehicle. They drove back to Thornhill Crossing in silence. The town was different when they arrived. The fire had been contained, the residential area spared, but the eastern forest was gone. Miles of black. Smoke still rising from hot spots that would burn for days, and something else had changed. People stood in the streets, not evacuating, watching. As Merrick's cruiser pulled up in front of the veterinary clinic, as Martha carried Owen inside the diner wrapped in a blanket, as Thad lifted Ranger out and carried him toward the clinic door, they watched a man and a woman who had walked into fire and come back with 2 lives. And they began to understand something they'd spent 35 years trying to ignore. Silence had a cost, and that cost was paid in pieces. In children who almost died, in neighbors who got sick, in a forest that burned because the ground beneath it was poisoned. Dr. Iris Calloway was waiting at the clinic. She'd already called a veterinarian from the next town over. The vet worked on Ranger's leg for 40 minutes. Stitches, bandages, antibiotics, a painkiller. Ranger tried to refuse before Thad held his muzzle and made him swallow. When it was done, Ranger lay on a folding cot in the back room, his leg wrapped in white gauze. He looked smaller, older, the gray around his muzzle more visible in the fluorescent light, but his eyes were still sharp, still watching. Thad sat on the floor beside the cot. He rested his hand on Ranger's neck, felt the steady rise and fall of breathing, felt the warmth of life that had refused to quit. "You saved 3 people today," Thad said quietly. "You know that?" Ranger's tail thumped. Once. Iris stood in the doorway. She held her familiar accordion folder. "The fire exposed 2 of the burial sites," she said. "The heat burned away the topsoil. EPA is already on site. They can't ignore it now." Thad looked up. Grimwood. Sterling Grimwood submitted his resignation an hour ago, effective immediately. The company's being dissolved pending federal investigation. Thad exhaled slowly. The town, scared, angry, but alive. Iris stepped into the room. "Because of you." "Not me." Thad looked at Ranger. "Him." Iris knelt down. She reached out slowly, letting Ranger sniff her hand. Then she rested it gently on the dog's head. "Thank you," she whispered. Ranger blinked. Slow. Accepting. 3 hours after they returned from the fire, Sheriff Dalton Merrick walked into the clinic. It was exactly 73 minutes since the EPA had arrived at the exposed contamination sites. Thad knew because he'd been counting. The way soldiers count. The way men who've lost time measure what remains. Merrick stood in the doorway for a long moment. He looked older than he had that morning. Smaller, as if something that had been holding him upright for 35 years had finally collapsed. He walked to where Thad sat, stood there silently. Then he pulled a photograph from his jacket pocket. The same Polaroid from the rail car. 3 men standing in front of the diesel car. Merrick, Grimwood's father, and Silas Thornwell. "I was 33 years old," Merrick said quietly. "Silas came to me with evidence, showed me the barrels, the reports, everything. He trusted me." Thad didn't respond, just listened. "Grimwood offered me $50,000. Cash. More money than I'd ever seen. Enough to pay off my house, send my daughter to college." Merrick's hands trembled. "So I helped them. I helped bury the rail car. I told Silas's wife we couldn't find a body. I lied to this town for 35 years. He set the photograph on the floor between them. I'm turning myself in. Federal prosecutors. EPA, all of it. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know." His voice cracked. "Silas was my friend, and I killed him as surely as if I'd pulled a trigger." Thad picked up the photograph, studied it. 3 young men who thought they had time to fix their mistakes. "You can't change what you did," Thad said, "but you can decide what you do next." Merrick's eyes were wet. "What's that?" "Tell the truth. All of it. Every name. Every dollar. Every barrel." Thad's voice was quiet, steady. "Give Silas Thornwell the ending he deserved." Merrick nodded. He turned and walked out of the clinic. Thad heard the cruiser start, heard it drive away. And then there was silence. Iris left an hour later. The vet gave Thad instructions for Ranger's care and departed. The clinic emptied until it was just Thad and Ranger in the back room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Thad lay down on the floor beside the cot. His body ached, his lungs burned, his hands were blistered from heat and ash. But Ranger was breathing, and that was enough. "We did it," Thad whispered. "We stayed." Ranger's tail thumped twice. Agreement. Outside, the sun broke through the smoke. Pale. Weak. But there, marked. 3 weeks later, the snow returned. Not the angry snow of December. The gentle snow of late winter that falls like forgiveness and covers everything in quiet. Thad stood on the porch of the cabin he'd started building on his 40 acres. The frame was up, the roof mostly complete. Not much, but enough. A place to sleep that wasn't a tent. A place that might eventually feel like home. The land had been declared part of the EPA cleanup zone, but Thad had negotiated to keep a small parcel for personal use. It turned out that accepting Sterling Grimwood's buyback offer, the full $25,000, and immediately donating half to the EPA cleanup fund while using the rest for building materials had earned him a certain amount of goodwill with federal regulators. Iris had helped him navigate the paperwork. She visited twice a week now, brought coffee, sometimes stayed for dinner. talked about geology and soil remediation and the small, stubborn ways the earth repaired itself when given the chance. Thad wasn't sure what they were yet. Friends, maybe. Something more, maybe not. But it was enough to sit across from someone and talk about the future without flinching. Ranger lay beside him on a wool blanket. The bandage was off now. The leg healed. A scar ran through the fur, visible when the light hit it right. He still limped slightly, probably always would, but his eyes were bright, alert, watching the forest with the calm certainty of a dog who had done his job and knew it. A few days ago, a family passing through it had stopped at the cabin. A man, his wife, and two young kids. They'd gotten lost on the logging roads and needed directions back to Highway 89. The youngest kid, maybe 5 years old, had seen Ranger on the porch and run up. "Mommy, look, a doggy." Before anyone could stop him, the kid had reached out and patted Ranger's head. "Good boy, such a good dog." Ranger's eyes had opened. Slowly, he'd looked at the child, then at Thad, then back at the child, and blinked. Once, very deliberately, the kind of blink that said, "I am K9 Unit 447 with 7 years of decorated military service in explosive detection and personnel protection. I am not a good boy. I am a consummate professional." The child had giggled, oblivious. Thad had laughed so hard he'd nearly dropped his coffee mug. The family had left shortly after the father, still apologizing for his son's enthusiasm, completely unaware of the silent judgment he'd just witnessed. Ranger had returned to his blanket with an air of dignified offense that lasted exactly until Thad gave him a piece of jerky. Then all was forgiven. Now standing on the porch, Thad smiled at the memory. The EPA had cordoned off all 7 burial sites. Cleanup would take 18 months, maybe longer. Sterling Grimwood was cooperating with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Sheriff Merrick had resigned and turned state's evidence, providing detailed testimony about the 1989 cover-up. The town was healing, slowly, painfully, but healing. Martha Kemp had stopped by yesterday with a basket of food and an invitation to Sunday dinner. Owen was back in school. Cody Harlan had moved with his family to Billings for his father's new job, but the boys sent Ranger a hand-drawn picture every week. The latest showed a German Shepherd with a cape labeled Super Ranger. Thad had taped it to the cabin wall. Dr. Iris Calloway had been hired as the lead consultant for the cleanup effort. She'd set up a small office in town and was working with EPA engineers to develop a remediation plan that would restore the contaminated sites over the next 2 years. She pulled up now in her beat-up Subaru, the back window still displaying that Geologist Rock bumper sticker. She got out carrying a thermos and 2 mugs. "Brought coffee?" she called. Ranger's tail wagged, slow, approving. Iris climbed onto the porch. She poured coffee and handed Thad a mug. They stood side by side, watching snow fall across the clearing. "You're staying," she said, not a question. "Yeah." "Good." Iris sipped her coffee. "Town needs people who don't run." Thad looked at Ranger. The dog's ears flicked toward them, listening, then returned to watching the trees. "I didn't stay," Thad said quietly. "He did." Iris followed his gaze. "He's a good dog. Best I've ever known." They stood in comfortable silence, drinking coffee, watching snow erase the last traces of ash, watching the forest begin slowly to remember what it had been before the poison. Ranger shifted, rested his chin on Thad's boot, sighed, content. And Thad felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, not yet, but something close. The absence of guilt, the presence of purpose, the quiet knowledge that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He'd come to Thornhill Crossing to disappear. Instead, he'd been found. Not by people, not by place, but by the steady, unyielding loyalty of a dog who refused to let the truth stay buried, who refused to let a good man run from the only fight that mattered, the fight to stay, to witness, to stand in the gap between what was and what could be. Thad finished his coffee, set down the mug, rested his hand on Ranger's head. "We're home," he said softly. Ranger's tail thumped. Once, twice. Agreement. And in the distance beyond the trees, beyond the snow, the town of Thornhill Crossing began to heal. Not because a hero had arrived, but because a man and a brother had chosen to stay. And sometimes that was the only miracle the world needed. Sometimes God doesn't send thunder from the heavens. Sometimes he sends a quiet choice, a loyal friend, a refusal to look away when looking away would be easier. Thaddeus Brennett came to Thornhill Crossing to escape his past, to disappear into 40 acres of Montana forest and forget the voice of Corporal Vance, asking why over the static of a dying radio. But Ranger taught him something the desert never could. Courage isn't about running toward danger or away from it. Courage is staying when everything in you screams to leave. It's the dog who sits in your path and refuses to move. The letter written by a dead man who trusted you'd find it. The two boys pulled from poisoned ground because someone finally stopped pretending not to see. It's choosing again and again to be the kind of person who doesn't run. In our daily lives, we face the same choice Thad faced. The moment when silence feels safer than speaking. When walking away feels easier than standing firm. When fear grows louder than conscience. We tell ourselves it's not my problem. Someone else will handle it. What difference can one person make? But Thad learned what we all must learn eventually. Silence isn't neutrality, it's permission. And one person standing with one faithful companion can change everything. The sinkhole that nearly swallowed two children existed because 40 barrels were buried in 1989, and no one spoke. The sister who died of cancer at 32 died because soil reports were altered and no one spoke. The forest that burned the town that lived in fear the man who disappeared without a trace, all of it happened because good people chose silence over truth until one man didn't. Not because he was brave. Thad will tell you he wasn't brave. He'll tell you he just had a beau who wouldn't let him leave. But that's the point. Sometimes God's miracles don't look like miracles. They look like a German shepherd sitting in the snow refusing to budge. They look like a choice to stay when every instinct says go. They look like ordinary people doing hard things because someone has to. The greatest miracles aren't the ones that change the world around us. They're the ones that change the world inside us. That transform a man who came to hide into a man who stayed to witness. That turn a town afraid to speak into a town learning to heal. That prove again and again that faithfulness matters more than fearlessness. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments, what moment stayed with you most? Subscribe so you don't miss more stories of loyalty, faith, and the quiet courage it takes to do what's right when no one is watching. May God bless you and keep you. May He guide your steps through fear and doubt. May He place faithful companions beside you when you need them most, whether they walk on two legs or four. And may you find the courage to stay when staying is the hardest thing you'll ever do. Because sometimes the greatest miracle isn't escaping the storm. It's becoming strong enough to walk through it. With faith, with purpose, and with a friend who refuses to quit. Just like Ranger taught Thad. Just like we must teach each other. Stay, witness, speak truth. Even when it costs everything. Especially then. Amen.